Thank you, Mark, and thank you all for being here tonight. I'm just thrilled to have such an excellent turnout. It's a very, very exciting time for the High. I see many familiar faces here, but also many new ones. So I'm very pleased with that. I want to start off, I'm Carol Thompson, the Fred and Rita Richman Curator of African Art here at the High. I joined the museum in, just about exactly 4 years ago. My first day was September 17th, 2001. So a lot has happened in a very short amount of time. So I'm going to, this evening, show you what I've been doing. I'm going to present some of the highlights of recent acquisitions. Also reviewing, just very quickly, my 2 exhibitions. And then I'll also, towards the end of my presentation, give you some information about a project that is very dear to my heart. It's a large-scale contemporary project called, working title, Global Africa, Contemporary Art of the Black Atlantic World. It will be in our big, beautiful new 10,000 square foot special exhibition space on the 2nd floor of the Whelan Pavilion. It'll open in February of 2007. So that is what I'll end with. But before I begin, actually, this was my job description. I was hired to build the collection, develop the African art exhibition schedule, plan the installation of the African art galleries. And I'll actually start installing the galleries on Monday and be finished, hopefully, by September 30th. So well in advance of opening day. It's very, very exciting. I know Jeffrey Grove, our curator of contemporary art, when he was speaking to the collections committee recently, said how installing the skyway of the Whelan Pavilion with contemporary art made him giddy. And I'm just so looking forward to my day, a week from, on the 19th. I want to read a short quote from a review that appeared in the New York Times very recently. Perhaps, I know some of you saw it because someone actually emailed me the link. It appeared in the New York Times on Friday, August 19th, so very recently. A review by Holland Cotter. I hope we can get him here to do a review of our permanent installation of African art. He says, in age, variety, and beauty, art from Africa is second to none. Africa had traditions of abstract art, performance art, installation art, and conceptual art centuries before the West ever dreamed up the names. So why is African art given such scant attention in 2005? Why are precious opportunities to study and document it lost for lack of money, personnel, and encouragement? Future historians probably will not have clear answers. Cultural blindness is hard to explain. Charitably, they will assume that universities and museums did what they could with the limited vision that they had. I'm happy that the High has the vision to include in its expansion plans a big, beautiful new space for African art. It's a very, very wonderful opportunity to be responsible for putting all that together. I want to read another little quote. This was something that I received on just last week, announcing the opening of a permanent installation of African art at a museum in Berlin. And in the one short little 4-paragraph announcement, they state, the new permanent exhibition makes clear that art from Africa has its own art historical development, which the Western world failed to understand or recognize for a long time. African art was instead regarded as primitive, a stigma based on the ideology of the colonial age. When I was an intern at the Metropolitan Museum in 1986, was when I just finished my coursework at the University of Iowa. When I got the letter in the mail saying I was accepted into the program, I practically flew to the post office. I was so thrilled to send my acceptance letter back. But when I got there, I worked in, and everyone in the department that takes care of Art of Africa, Oceania, Native America, Art of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas was called Primitive Art. Everyone answered the phone, Primitive Art. We actually met with Philippe de Montebello, the director of the museum, and I asked, why does the Metropolitan maintain this antiquated name for the department that covers the art of these regions? And he said, it's not meant as anything negative. Finally, in the early 90s, they gave that up. But you can still go to the Met, and people sometimes give you directions to the 20th Century Gallery through the Primitive Art Wing. So some people say, it doesn't necessarily mean something negative. How can it not? Sorry, I can't accept that, even though I once thought that way myself when I entered grad school at the University of Iowa, but I've since reformed my ways. So African art was instead regarded as primitive, a stigma based on the ideology of the colonial age. And what does that mean, colonial age? One last little quote, and then I'll move into my images. I have plenty of them to show, as always. This comes from a book that was used as the text when I studied African art at the University of Iowa. That's where I did my master's degree. It was an exhibition catalog called For Spirits and Kings. It was an exhibition curated by Susan Vogel, works from the Tishman collection that are now actually in the hands of Disney, Walt Disney Imagineering. We'll have 3 works on loan from them on opening day. So this quote, and just pretend you're a student studying African art, and this is what you read in one of your texts. In Tsai country, that's in Western Congo, during the quote-unquote pacification led by French soldiers between 1913 and 19, about 3/4 of the people died. 3/4. And nearly all artists ceased working. Years later, mask activity started up again in the post-independence era in the late 60s and 70s. Some artists are guided, this is based on the fieldwork that a woman from Europe did in the late 60s and then 70s. Some artists, she says, are guided by the memory of their ancestors' work. Others imitate masks seen in the homes of friends. Still others are inspired by illustrations in books of African art sent by European collectors. Just with that as a sort of backdrop to my presentation, let me begin with the images. Okay. Up. So I did my bachelor's degree at Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm from a small town in Minnesota. This mask is in the collection of the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and it's the mask that first drew me to study African art. I wrote a 5-page term paper on it, and that's then what piqued my interest in African art. But at that point in time, I was also interested in Japanese art, 20th century art, art from lots of different times and places, Romanesque, French architecture. What continues to mesmerize me about this mask is the way that it appears to almost move, even though still. The way that the 3 faces overlap in a way that creates a wonderful kind of dynamism. It's from the northern border region between Ghana and Ivory Coast, and it was actually performed for Islamic festivals. So this is also, you think, Islam and African masking, wouldn't they be in opposition to one another? No. In fact, in certain regions of West Africa, where Islam has been a very powerful force going back for many, many, many hundreds of years, the two can be quite compatible. This is an article that was in the actual style section of the Times relatively recently. I just wanted to mention that masks, this is an image of a Punu mask from Gabon, Punu masks, up until recently, and fine Punu masks, late 19th, early 20th century works, could be acquired for less than, say, 100,000. But when this man became enamored with Punu masks and bid on this mask, the price of Punu masks just quadrupled, and since that time have now come to reach almost $1 million. So while African art is still an area in which you can build a world-class collection, it's getting harder and harder. The recent sales in Paris set new records for African art, with many works going for over $1 million. This is a mask that I would very, very much like to be able to acquire for the High. It's in a private collection in New York. It's the one loose end that is still unknown. It may be on view November 12th if we can come to closure on the negotiation, or it may not. So keep your fingers crossed for me on this one. Very, very naturalistic work. Punu masks like this one are actually portraits of particularly beautiful young women. They're danced by men, but in honor of this female spirit that also has a watery aspect. Those are fish scales, representation of fish scales at her forehead, and her hairstyle is meant to resemble a bivalve, I guess, mussel or clam. This is a shot of the African art installation at the Louvre. The Louvre the Louvre has had art of Egypt on view for a long, long time. But the art of sub-Saharan Africa was only included in the Louvre's galleries in the year 2000. Is my voice not loud enough? Are you having a hard time hearing? Yeah. Kevin, can you turn it up a little bit? Turn up the volume a little bit, please. Or I'll also try to turn up the volume a little bit. So, and also, I guess, dim the lights at the center of everywhere. So if you go to Paris, make sure to go to the Louvre and see the installation of African art. The works included in this installation are absolutely sublime. And my mantra at the High has become Louvre quality. I would like to build a collection of African art that is Louvre quality. I would like to acquire works that are of the finest of their type. Sublime works that represent Africa at absolutely the highest level. When I was in undergraduate school, and introduced to African art at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, I became fascinated as well with bois masks from Burkina Faso. Since that time, the art of Burkina Faso has been a particular focus of mine. It's where I've spent the most time. Visited for the first time in '87, and then have been returning every other year for the last 5 years. The mask on the left is from the collection of Thomas Wheelock, a New York African art collector. One very similar to it, and this is probably a 19th century example on the left, is in the collection of the Minneapolis Institute. And you can get an idea of the scale. The image on the right, you can see a very playful image of my friend Patricia Blanchet, who traveled with me to Burkina. Some of you saw her show, Burkina Reflected, at the Atlanta College of Art. These masks are just like a zigzag that goes straight up into the sky for up to 15 or 17 feet. The High now has a bois snake mask in its collection. And we also have 3 plank masks, like the mask that you see leaning against the trunk of the big mango tree where the carvers of Boni make the masks. This mask will be on view on November 12th It's a mask that was carved by a Yoruba artist from Nigeria. It's probably, again, 19th century work. The eyes are highlighted with either indigo powder or rickets bluing, the bright blue powder that the British brought with them when they colonized Nigeria, the powder that's used to starch or bleach and starch shirts, and then red pigment on the head tie. Gelede masks. Gelede is a Yoruba men's masquerade association that honors women through masking. UNESCO added Gelede to its list of intangible items of world heritage several years ago. And I think this is very interesting because they didn't list the wooden headpiece as the masterwork, but rather the performance, which includes, of course, dance and song. This is my publication from 1993, published by the Museum for African Art in the New Press, and it pictures this mask on the cover. This is the kind of work that I'm working to acquire for the High. It's in a New York private collection. It will be on loan to the High for 1 year, and I think we have first option for its purchase. It won't be a gift. I already tried that one. And this is a photograph from the 80s showing a Gelede headpiece. You can see it's worn actually at the top of the head with a kind of veil covering the man's face. And then the man is wrapped in women's head ties so that when he dances, all of the beautiful fabric spins around his body. And this is a work by contemporary artist David Hammonds called Freudian Slip. David Hammonds went to what used to be an African art market at Chelsea Mini Storage in New York and bought a Gelede mask of the type that is mass-produced for the Western market and put it underneath a sort of old-fashioned woman's slip to make it look like the mask formed a pregnant woman's stomach. And to me, this is a very sort of beautiful sort of honoring of Gelede through a work of contemporary art. So this is a question that was asked when I was invited to Detroit. So how is the High Museum of Atlanta building a collection of African art for a city known as a Black cultural mecca and cradle of the civil rights movement? I was invited by the Detroit Institute of Art's Friends of African and African American Art, one of the strongest organizations of its kind in any museum across the country. It was a roundtable discussion. Nee Kwakkerpoom, who's the curator of African art there, moderated. Doran Ross was a speaker, and then I also spoke. The topic was, as you can see, African art and African American communities, bridging the gulf between the museum and the public. This is a subject that's very much on my mind, and it's what actually drew me from New York to Atlanta, because I think I have a particular role here and now in this place at this time. And now, these are two books that I recommend to all of you who are interested in collecting African art. Both of these books study the trade network, the network of African art dealers, African and European American, that sort of crisscrosses the globe. The book on the left, African Art in Transit, includes black and white photographs, images that you see on the right. I'm sorry, some of you probably heard me talk about this before, but I continue to be just sort of astounded by this whole sort of proposition. But it was a couple of decades ago, actually these are ladders and house posts. They became admired as art objects. And dealers in New York, and even here in Atlanta, you can find sometimes contemporary art galleries have a Dogon ladder. And these were actually used, leaned against the wall of a house, the exterior wall very often, to climb up to the roof. Functional objects but once they made it into the African art market network, they became art objects. So this is an interesting process. And Chris Steiner investigates this in his book, African Art in Transit. And he tells a story of an African art dealer in Abidjan who was stockpiling mortars. The mortar and pestles are what women use to pound the grain in rural regions of Africa. This is a picture I took when I was in Burkina in 2001, and I was teasing this man saying, hold on to your pestles, because, you know, they've become in great demand on the African art market. And the sort of joke in Abidjan was this man who was stockpiling all of these pestles, the other African art dealers said to him, sure, they went for ladders, but they're not going to go for pestles, you know, give it up. This is not going to be the new thing. But wrong. Just, you know, you can go to Sotheby's and buy a pestle. I think Jason Wirtz has seen a mortar and pestle at Jason Wirtz's gallery, Wirtz Contemporary, and he uses them to pound lavender so you can have a beautifully scented loft. So new purposes for mortar and pestles from Africa. This was the very first work acquired by the High since my arrival. It's a 19th century Ethiopian painting. I was really pleased to receive this as a gift and to present it to the museum's collection committee, because I think very often when people think of African art, they think of masks and figures made of wood. And while those works are the classic forms that first drew me to the study of African art is much, much more than that. And diversify has become one of my sort of other mantras as I build the collection of African art at the High. I would like to build a collection that includes a great variety of materials and object types to better represent the richness of African art forms. So a painting, and also from Ethiopia, an area that's very often neglected by museums with African art collections. Also, and this was while Tom Southall, our former curator of photography, was here, we collaborated to acquire 3 photographs by a photographer living and working in Bamako, Mali. His name is Malik Sidibé. And we acquired 3 vintage prints. This is the one that I picked out, and I love it for the way that these young men are wearing bell-bottoms trousers, and everyone in the picture has a radio with them. 1968, that was me in 1968 as well. And I think this work presents a whole different image of Africa than the one often found in museums that focus exclusively on the late 19th, early 20th century masks and figurative sculpture. Manja Diawara, Director of Africana Studies at NYU, has written about Malik Sidibé's work in an essay called The 1960s in Bamako, Malik Sidibé and James Brown. He describes how these photographs show how the young people in Bamako had embraced rock and roll as a liberation movement, adopted the consumer habits of an international youth culture, and developed a rebellious attitude towards all forms of established authority. To say that Bamako's youth is on the same page as the youth in London and Paris in the 1960s and 70s is also to acknowledge Malik Sidibé's role in shaping and expanding that culture. What Sidibé's photographs achieve is to teach us to become more tolerant of today's hip-hop culture. To understand that their action is not devoid of politics, and to see in them the triumph of the diaspora. And hip-hop has reached Burkina. And every year when I go to Burkina and rent a 4x4 with my friend Patricia, and we drive all across the countryside, our driver has a great collection of Burkinabe hip-hop, and we have it full blast as we're moving around the countryside. It's fabulous hip-hop, very distinctively Burkinabe. It's not the same as hip-hop here in the U.S. Another work, well, no. This is the catalog cover on the left from an exhibition that was organized by the Museum for African Art. It was actually presented here in Atlanta over at Clark Atlanta. And while the High has not acquired any works by Chibumba or Barotsi, one of the artists working in what used to be Zaire, northeastern Zaire, this is an area of collecting that I think would be very interesting for the High, as based in the city of Atlanta with Martin Luther King, an important figure here. The author of this catalog is actually working on a project that looks at cultural heroes through contemporary art, focusing particularly on Patrice Lumumba, who you see pictured here, Martin Luther King, and Nelson Mandela. These works while they were painted as a kind of popular art form by self-taught artists, they don't really have a market. They're not highly collected, but there are many of them in various sort of pockets in different parts of the world. This is a work on paper by now deceased artist John Mwafangejo from Southern Africa. I think this would also, he produced a whole huge series of prints, and this one I think would be particularly appropriate for the High's collection. We will have a wonderful new works on paper gallery at the street level of the Whelan Pavilion just outside the African Art Gallery. And I apologize for the quality of this image. This is not a professional quality image. It's a little digital image that I snapped when I was visiting a dealer in New York. I successfully presented this work to the Collections Committee in May. It's a large-scale paper construction by contemporary South African artist Kay Hassan. The title of the work is Bus Ride. And I love the colossal scale of the figures. I also love the different moods with these two figures on the left with their heads in the clouds, and then in the middle section, kind of two people in intimate conversation, and then on my far right, a sort of introspective figure. The artist calls this work a triptych, so it is in 3 parts. It requires a wall that's at least 15 feet wide, so it's a very large-scale work. Kay Hassan's work is being collected by contemporary art museums across the US and Europe and Africa. So I'm very pleased that this work is in the High's collection. So this is the title of the show that will open until 2007. Bus Ride will be included in that exhibition. More on that project a little bit later. This is our current building, and just, I'm sure now all of you are pretty much aware of this, but this is the Whelan Pavilion. African art will be visible from 16th Street, and you can actually go and look into the galleries now. The walls are painted. The center wall will be a beautiful blue. The second floor of this building will be for special exhibitions, and that's where Global Africa will be presented. So this is an image I snapped a while back. As you can see, we're much closer to the finish line now than we were then. You'll be able to see through these 3 wide windows into the African Art Gallery. In the center window, you'll see 3 bois masks from Burkina Faso, created in 1986 and 1987. We acquired them directly from the sculptor who made them, Yakuba Bonde, who a very entrepreneurial man who's become the artistic director of the small town of Boni, Burkina Faso. This is a mask that was gifted to the museum by Lucinda Bunnin. And I apologize for the terrible quality of this image. This was an installation that was presented at what used to be the Center for African Art when it was still in 2 adjacent brownstones at 68th and Park in New York City. It was one of the first exhibitions I worked on. We brought together a whole group of very fine quality masks from Burkina Faso from New York private collections. And the man who was my translator when I was in Burkina in '87 actually shipped us costumes. So we presented the masks as though in full costume and about to stand up and perform. Security guards told me that people would come in and stand for 20 minutes, absolutely mesmerized by this entourage. I would like to one-up that here at the High. and actually bring an entourage of musicians and masqueraders to have plank masks, snake mask. There are also animal forms, a 9-foot wide butterfly mask, a hawk mask, a hyena mask, a monkey mask, antelope, and have them move in procession across the Renzo Piano Piazza. And this is not such a crazy idea. Yakuba Bonde has already organized 2 visits to Europe for an entourage of musicians and masqueraders from his small town. 14 men traveled to France, Switzerland, and Holland and Belgium to perform in world cultural festivals. I hope to do this in collaboration with Emily Hanna, curator of African art at the Birmingham Art Museum, when she presents an exhibition that focuses on the art of bois art of Burkina Faso. So, procession. Can you see it? I think Renzo Piano's idea of a village for the arts with the piazza as the sort of heart of the space would work very well, because that's just how the masks move in the small town. They come out from all of the side streets and move around actually with small groups of people. It becomes a very, very interactive thing, not like a parade with people standing on the sidelines, but everybody very involved. This is a mask that will be on loan to the High for 1 year on opening day. It comes from the collection of Tom Wheelock. His collection is the best collection of art from Burkina Faso in the world. I've cataloged that collection. I've done 2 exhibitions from that collection. One when I was teaching as an adjunct at Vassar, and another at Carleton College in St. Paul. So he has more than 1,000 works from Burkina Faso, so certainly we ought to be able to make some inroads in that direction. This is one of the most magnificent works in his collection, with the red costume, as you can see, still attached. So my first exhibition, just to remind, I hope many of you saw this show. It opened in December of 2002. For This World and Beyond, African Art from the Fred and Rita Richman collection. It was presented on the museum's 3rd floor. This work was pictured on the banner, ramp banner, so that if you drove down Peachtree, you would see this mask. It's a Kwese mask from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Its face is painted white to show that it is a representative of the ancestral and spiritual realm. This exhibition looked at African art's social relevance and its spiritual significance. In some ways, it was kind of a dry run for the piano installation, and we sort of learned from that presentation and are keeping some of the elements and modifying others. This is Michael Shapiro and Ed Brown with the Kwese mask on opening night with beautiful blue wall. We're going to have a blue wall, if I didn't say that already again. And I was most proud of this section of the exhibition that focused on gender relations in African art. It was called Masks, Men and Women. But what I particularly loved about this was there was no plexiglass anywhere. I'm very anti-plexi, but sometimes you have to have plexiglass covers to protect the art, especially small objects or delicate surfaces. But in this gallery, the masks were presented at roughly at eye level, so you could be right in their presence. I thought it was very successful. And in all in this show and the Gold Show, we included large-scale photo murals. In the piano installation, we'll have a couple of beautiful scrims. And as a result of that exhibition, we received a year-end gift in 2002, 50 works, 50 of some of the most important works from the collection of Fred and Rita Richman. This is a reliquary guardian figure. It was once attached to a bundle of ancestral relics as a kind of guardian of those sacred things. 19th century example, covered with brass applique. And I'm sorry, this image is a bit blurry. This is one of the other gifts, 2002 gifts. It's a Songhay figure about 12 inches high. It's hard to tell in this image, but very, very fine quality work. Still also with all of the added elements intact. Look at the way that the hand sort of sprays out in a very sort of dynamic way. It's a Songhai sculpture. It was, and let me actually, let's see. These sculptures were conceived as containers for bishimba, secret formula assembled by the Nganga, the traditional healer, priest, religious leader, to achieve specific goals and drawing on the power of ancestral spirits. Without these substances, the sculptures were considered just pieces of wood without purpose. In this sculpture, the bishimba is added at the top of the head and then wrapped around the body. This Motoko pear was also a gift from the Richmans at that time. The Richmans have focused on images of couples throughout their collection, and they collect not only African art, but art from lots of different times and places. So one of the strengths of the High's collection, therefore, is paired figures. And this Motoko pear is one of my favorites. In conjunction with the Richmond exhibition, if you remember, I did an adjacent small exhibition, Building the Collection Initiative, and as a result of that was able to acquire two works. This Mangbetu vessel from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, made probably around 1910. It's a prestige object that was probably created as a gift for dignitaries, visiting dignitaries. And you can see the hairstyle of Mangbetu women is included in that vessel. This photo was taken around 1910. Also, a result of that Building the Collection initiative, the museum acquired this little miniature Lobi figure on the left, a gift of Emmett Bondurant and Jane Fahey. It's from the Burkina Faso Ivory Coast border area. And in Burkina Faso, in the Lobi region, sculptures like this are considered animate. They're known by the Lobi people as bateba. Sculptures like this one were carved to act as intermediaries between people and protective spirits called phila. The sculptures carry out the orders of the protective spirits on behalf of individuals and communities, protecting them from harm. On the right, not a very good quality image. It's a little iron sculpture from Burkina Faso that was a gift from Maureen and Harold Zarember in New York. Probably came from a diviner's shrine in the form of a snake. I don't make generalized statements about Africa and art that often, but snakes, in contrast to the way they're viewed through Christianity, have lots of positive associations. They're considered protective and a link to the ancestors rather than negatively. This is a more recent gift from Fred and Rita Richman. Very beautiful, rather large-scale Lobi head. Functioned roughly in the same way as the little miniature sculpture I just showed you. And this was a year-end gift in 2004 from Bernard and Patricia Wagner, New Jersey African art collectors. It's a Pende cup from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Definitely a Louvre quality item. Prestige cup. It was used for drinking palm wine. Very playful, kind of large head, small foot, holding it up. And then my second exhibition, African Gold, from the Glassell Collection, Museum of Fine Arts, Houston. Bird of Sankofa. Sorry. Did I delete some of those slides? You remember the ring, beautiful starburst rings. No, there we are. So African Gold from the Glassell Collection with the beautiful iron gong with the bird of Sankofa standing up above. We presented In the first section, a little brief history of West Africa and the rise of the Akan states going back to the time of Mansa Musa, the medieval king who made the pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century and gave away so much gold that merchants in Venice became curious about the source of that gold. And this is the beautiful gong with the bird of Sankofa. Wisdom in gold. In this section, we presented the staff finials that convey through their carved imagery proverbs. And this is, again, a working image. I was able to successfully present this work to the Collections Committee in May. This is a staff finial like those I just showed you. This was carved by the Akan or Asante artist Ose Bonsu, who lived until 1979, visited the United States twice. Very, very prolific artist. It's carved out of wood, covered with gold leaf. The proverb refers to the idea that even though the man seated on the typical Akan stool is the chief, he should listen to his closest counselors and not make decisions alone. This was the show that was circulated all around the country. There are seats down in front, so feel free, just come walk right in. Maybe you saw Wrapped in Pride over at the Carlos. One of my favorite sections focused on the photographs of children dressed up in Akan regalia. The high acquired, and this image doesn't capture the beauty of this work. This is a magnificent textile woven of silk thread. It was made probably between 1900 and 1925. I found it at the Tribal Art and Textile Fair. I don't like to use that word tribal, like I don't like to use the word primitive, but that's what it's called. So Tribal Art and Textile Fair in the Armory on Park Avenue in the 60s. This is a very, very, very fine example of kente, and it has the most complicated of all patterns known as I have exhausted all of my skills. Weavers weave cloths like this to show off what they can do. What is also magnificent, it has the beautiful golden color, and again, this image is not true. You have to come and see it. It's much more beautiful than how it appears here. It's not the full cloth. It's actually a cloth that's had areas of wear and it has been reconstituted, but that is no problem. That is what is done with cloths that are highly valued when they have areas of wear, both for use in Africa and also for the Western market. The palette is very, very unusual, with the bright, almost robin's egg blue, lime green, and then one red accent. Also, the warp threads have stripes with broad bands of red to refer to the word Oyokoman. The Oyoko lineage has produced all of the kings, the Asantehene, going back to the founding of the kingdom around 1700. So it's very special cloth. So that's one of the areas in which I'd like to build. African textiles are one of my sort of favorite areas. Fred and Rita founded a second endowment about a year ago to help the High establish regional leadership in African art. The money can be used for acquisitions, exhibitions, publications, programming, travel, and research. So this is a wonderful thing. Now I would like to gain local support to match what Fred and Rita have done, and then we'll be in fine shape. So I'm now going to tell you a little bit about the installation of the African Art Gallery. It's inspired by the Congo cosmogram that charts the cycle of life. And there are various ways of representing this, but very often it's a circle with 4 points, and the movement is counterclockwise. At this point, 3 o'clock marks birth. This point marks prime of life. Over here, the role of elders, and here, honoring the ancestors. Now, imagine 16th Street, 3 wide windows, rectangle, door to the gallery. This is where you'll enter, birth, and you'll move in a circular path through the gallery. So this is the framework, the thematic framework that I've used to organize the space. This is a painting by Radcliffe Bailey, our very own Radcliffe Bailey. It was included in a show at Solomon Projects last was it last summer or summer before? And I can't show you here, but Radcliffe very often includes the Congo cosmogram in his work. And in this painting, it's somewhere actually perpendicular to the screen. You can't see it. This is three-dimensional, right inside. But you can see it, and now this is hard to see, but I'll explain where. Pretend you're on the escalator descending in the international terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. This is a detail of Radcliffe's painting. The title is Saints. And I practically fell down the escalator when I saw this. Here's the Congo cosmogram, and he's even indicated arrows to show the movement. So at the time that I came, I was on a flight that was delayed and it was put through the international terminal. I was just finishing my text for the Richman catalog, and as I was writing about this work, I thought, nobody's going to follow this. Nobody cares. Nobody knows about this. And then I see Radcliffe's painting with the Congo cosmogram. This magnificent little miniature sculpture is, again, of Louvre quality. It's one of my favorite works in the show, or in the collection I'm in, and that will be presented in the Richman Gallery, the Fred and Rita Richman Gallery. It's very hard to see, but the body is inlaid with metal, geometric patterns, like the patterns that you see in Congo hats and Congo textiles. At the center of her forehead and at both temples, there are 4 points marking what I just told you, the Dikenga, the Congo cosmogram that charts the cycle of life. So this plan actually, our thematic framework, actually radiates from this work. And just to, as a point of comparison, one of the exhibitions I worked on when I was with the Museum for African Art in the late 80s was a show called Africa and the Renaissance, Art in Ivory. And it included this magnificent ivory that was carved by an artist in the Kingdom of the Congo during the 16th century. This ivory entered the collection of Cosimo de' Medici. So Cosimo de' Medici collected African art. Who knew? Anyway, this hat and this beautiful pillow cover, actually, this was used as a form of currency. But these are from, I think they're both from 17th century works from a museum in Copenhagen. So we, like some of the more important European museums, also have a magnificent Congo hat. So I'm very pleased with that. And there was not a Richmond gift, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the woman who gave us that hat, but it was gifted to the museum already many decades ago, before my arrival. So we'll start with birth. And in this section, and again, I'm sorry, this image is breaking up a little bit, we'll have this magnificent Congo mother and child, a 2002 gift from Fred and Rita Richman. Very, very beautiful work, beautiful, beautiful carving, very clearly defined forms. Broad hat studded with brass tacks as a sign of prestige. Her eyes are covered with glass or mirrored glass, and so are the baby's eyes. Also, one of the first, you'll see this fang pair as you enter the African Art Gallery. These two sculptures were pictured in the art newspaper's survey of museum acquisitions during my first year. They're very, very important gifts from Fred and Rita Richman. It's very unusual to see fang sculptures still united as here, even though they were very often carved as pairs, but most often they get separated as they change hands over the course of their lifetime. These are from the Cameroon region, the northern fang. Originally, fang sculptures like these, and you see their knees are, their knees are bent. That's because there are also, as you can see, sort of stems jutting from the back. These sculptures were sat on the rims of cylindrical bark boxes that contained ancestral relics. They were carved as guardian figures. That's why they very often have very well-developed biceps. They appear as sentinels, just upright and at attention. Matisse de Derain very much loved Fang art, and Matisse's famous painting, The Blue Nude, in the museum in Baltimore, is very much inspired by Fang sculpture. This was considered a very, very radical work in its time. This is another pair. These two figures are not a couple, but rather twin sculptures. Yoruba women have twins more often than any other women in the world, and twins are considered particularly wonderful and a great blessing. But they also have a high mortality rate. So if a twin dies, a sculpture is carved to keep the spirit of the deceased nearby. And twin sculptures are washed and fed and put to bed at night. That's why the faces on the sculptures are so worn. The heads are rubbed with blue and the bodies with red. And that ties into the pantheon of Yoruba gods and goddesses. I'll tell you more about that. Next section of the exhibition will focus on Prime of Life. And in this section, you'll see, as I mentioned, 3 bois plank masks through the windows from 16th Street. Only a man in his prime of life can dance these masks. They're more than 6 feet high and weigh maybe around 50 pounds. So that's a model that we did some time ago. Sorry, you don't need to see that image again. And also in this section, we'll have on loan from Bernard and Patricia Wagner, the New Jersey collectors, another headpiece that's about 6 feet high. And this is a mask that was worn on top of the head, and the dancer would actually have to do a very acrobatic performance. It's a masquerade tradition that honors heroes, an Epa mask from Nigeria. And in this section, we'll also have a set of 3 masks, Mende masks from Sierra Leone. The one on the left came from Fred and Rita Richman. At the top of the mask is the British crown, if you didn't notice. And then the mask in the middle is a gift of Milton Mazo and Billy Poole, who are here in the room. And at the top, it's hard to see, but there's actually a metal amulet, Islamic amulet. So foreign powers represented in both of these works. And this is a mask from the collection of Patricia and Bernard Wagner. It's a promised gift to the high. So we'll have 3 of these masks. You remember in the Richman exhibition, I included this photograph next to the Richman Mende mask. I love this photo for the way that it shows the mask as almost as a member of the family. So family portrait, have to include the mask. Mende masks each have their own distinctive individual characters and personal names. Names are chosen by spirits and revealed to humans through dreams. When a mask performs, its personal name is called. During the colonial era, one mask became the leader of all other masks. It was nicknamed Sergeant Wule by a European who observed her strong, assertive spirit. In Mende communities, both men and women use masks. That's quite unusual because usually masking is a realm reserved only for men. Only men mask dance in, for instance, Burkina Faso and many, many other regions. But in Sierra Leone, women have a very strong masking association of their own. This is a mask from Nigeria, an Igbo mask that was probably made to honor Mami Wata. Mami Wata is Pidgin English for mother of water. I've become very fascinated by Mami Wata, and I think anyone, African Art 101, when you're introduced to Mami Wata, I know my students used to always be, I would have lots of students doing reports about Mami Wata. Mami Wata is often thought of as a particularly beautiful woman. Actually, I had a Nigerian taxi driver, and I was from eastern Nigeria, so I was asking him about Mami Wata, and he said, oh yes, Mami Wata, the beautiful woman who commands men. But Mami Wata has lots and lots of different characteristics. There's an exhibition being organized by UCLA. One of the earlier working titles was Mami Wata and her sisters in the Americas. In eastern Nigeria, Mami Wata, if you remember the video that we showed, it was a little short clip from a video called Mami Wata in Search of Water Spirits in Nigeria. It focused on a water spirit priestess named Mary Magdalena. And In eastern Nigeria, Mami Wata is, well, the priestesses of Mami Wata are healers, traditional healers. In Central Africa, Mami Wata is often personified as a mermaid and has many more negative associations. She's associated with sudden wealth, but wealth that brings also great sacrifice and sort of alienation from your community. This mask has two beautiful women's faces with a locket necklace as well. Mami Wata loves luxurious goods. Mami Wata is often considered as, or is often found where there are conflicts between more spiritually based African belief systems and Western capitalism. I think this is, a ripe topic for more research. So this was the video, Mami Wata. And this is an image that is based on a circus poster that was made in Hamburg, Germany at the end of the 19th century. It was at the time when circuses were just becoming popular. It was actually inspired by a photograph of a Samoan woman who performed in the quote-unquote people show as a snake charmer. This image has circulated all around Africa and inspired sculptures that are placed on shrines for Mami Wata. Second to the last section of the exhibition, the role of elders. In this section, we'll have the smaller scale Kishi, Songe and Kishi, and then the larger, more recent 2003 gift from Fred and Rita. And this beautiful little tobacco mortar, very, very worn surface, brass tacks. This imagery actually is associated with a particular 19th century king whose name I've forgotten. One moment here. The imagery refers to the arrival of the Portuguese many centuries before, but the imagery became popular during the 19th century. So this ivory bracelet comes from the 800-year-old Edo Kingdom of Benin. It's decorated with motifs that refer to the great 16th century warrior king, Oba Esigie. Motifs associated with Esigie were popular during the reign of the late 19th century king, Oba Overanwam. These motifs include a Portuguese soldier, as I mentioned, and then also the king in the guise of a leopard. The reason the surface of this bracelet is so reddish is because the deep burgundy color is the result of repeated applications of palm oil mixed with spirits. And the work on the right, it's a working digital image that I snapped in the home of the owner of this work. It's a Congo ivory, 19th century Congo ivory. It's actually of an enslaved woman. And whether or not we'll have this on view is a little uncertain right now. I hope so. So I want to include, or we will include in the installation of African art, works that come from historic African kingdoms, from, as I mentioned, the Kingdom of Benin, as well as the Kingdom of the Congo. This is a 17th century Dutch print that shows the palace in Benin City with the king on horseback in the foreground with leopards preceding him. And this is a Dutch print of the Congo capital. It's from the Dapper publication, for which the Dapper Foundation in Paris, the little museum that exhibits African art, is named. So people often forget, or as African history is so often neglected, Europeans first visited Africa, sailed around the coast in the 15th century, made contact with the Kingdom of Benin and with the Congo Kingdom. Final section of the installation, Honoring the Ancestors. In this section we'll have on loan from Bernard and Patricia Wagner this magnificent white beaded crown from the Yoruba Kingdom of Nigeria, which continues up to the present and dates back many centuries. When a king wears this crown, the crown connects him to the generations of previous rulers. So through a work of art, this connection between generations is maintained. And we'll have also in this section of the exhibition a beautiful textile beaded elephant mask from Cameroon on loan from Michael Mack and Craig Deal. The detailing of the beadwork in this example is particularly wonderful, with the whirling forms repeated throughout. Masks like this, they're highly abstract representations of elephants. They were danced by royalty, titled individuals, and men of a warrior class, with elaborate costumes that included leopard pelts and large feather headdresses. It's a Bembe mask from Democratic Republic of the Congo. It actually has 4 eyes, and masks like this would spin in performance. They performed during initiation rituals of the Alunga Association, a powerful men's organization in charge of educating adolescent males and maintaining law and order. As the young adepts learned the mysteries of the mask through songs, it instructed them, quote, "Alunga is not a man, but a thing, something from very remote times, something very powerful and awe-inspiring. Never profane its mysteries." Alunga associations were banned by the colonial government in 1947. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. The work on the right is a dance staff that was carved. It's to honor Eshu. Eshu is the Yoruba deity that mediates opposites. The Yoruba people of Nigeria, a number more than, 25 million, have a huge diaspora throughout the Americas. They have a pantheon of gods and goddesses that is in many ways comparable to the Greek and Roman pantheon. Eshu would be compared to Hermes or Mercury. So this is a dance staff for Eshu with faces looking at opposite directions. This is a work by contemporary artist Terry Atkins, someone who I got to know when I lived and worked in New York. It's called Eshu, very abstract work, but through its title makes reference to the Yoruba deity. This will be included in the African Art Gallery to make that connection. And this is not a good quality image. This work will be, when we have it on view, properly mounted so that you can actually see its feet. It's an egungun cloth masquerade. Egungun masquerades are created to, the Egungun Association honors ancestors through masking. This is, in real life, it stands maybe 6 feet, has a broad panel of cowrie shells in front, and then has panels of velvet as the outer layers of the mask. The outer layers of velvet date from the purple and the red from between 1750 and 1850. Quite remarkable. The inner layers are hand-spun cotton indigo cloth. The top of the mask, and it should have been photographed in 3/4 view, this is a carved bird's head. The Nigerian writer Wale Soyinka, in his book about his childhood, Ake, describes how one day when the Egungun masquerades were moving through the streets, he became so entranced by their performances that he followed them from neighborhood to neighborhood until at the end of the day he was lost and far away from home, and people simply passed him back until he was where he needed to be. This is a work that will not be included in the exhibition. I don't have the image of the work that will be here in its place. It's a Congo and Kisi Robert Ferris Thompson describes how Minkisi are portable sacred medicines of God. He says, in the U.S., Minkisi, the Kikongo plural of Nkisi, meaning medicated image or pake, are commonly known as charms. So Minkisi can take various forms, but this one is in the form of a miniature figure with a beautiful round mirror attached to its torso. Also in the gallery we'll have this memory jar that was made in Georgia during the early part of the 20th century. And I think I didn't write this, but I could very well have written this. This label copy was written by our former curator of decorative arts, not Stephen Harrison, but Donald Pierce. He says, this embellished memory job suggests a creolized form related to traditional spiritual and ritual grave decoration practices that originated in the Congo region of Africa and later spread throughout the entire African diaspora. The use of select personal items and materials common to memory jugs, seashells, mirrors, glass, white ceramics, and children's toys are comparable to African funerary practices. In Congo belief, the selection of white, reflective, or shiny materials served as a spiritual representation of the watery realm between this life and the next. Some of these objects, therefore, serve not only as grave decorations, but as guides for the spirits to the other world. Vessels and objects related to the deceased that were placed on grave sites to commemorate honor and show love for an individual. Sorry, something's missing in that sentence, but I think you get the gist here. This was an exhibition that I worked on at the Museum for African Art, curated by Dr. Robert Ferris Thompson. It was called Face of the Gods, Art and Altars of Africa and the African Americas. This photograph was taken in Brazil on the occasion when someone had gone to the beach to create these beautiful little altars for Yamaya, the goddess of the sea. And this is a tradition that crossed over from the Yoruba region of Nigeria to Brazil and continues up to the present. Yamaya in some ways is related to the sort of character of Mami Wata. She's particularly fond of white roses, perfume, and champagne. So very quickly, a few little highlights. I'm not going to stop on all of these images, but I want to just give you a little bit of information about global Africa, contemporary art of the Black Atlantic world. Skip that. Well, this image will not be included in the exhibition, but the exhibition will include works created since 1975. But I was really thrilled to see this work when I first joined the Hive by Jacob Lawrence. It's called Marionettes, and I think it's a very poignant work in that it shows African masks strewn across a stage, almost as though skulls, and no longer performing. This image reminds me of, if I could make this, what has happened here? Eshu, with a face black on one side and white on the other, and a tall top hat. So, the global Africa, well, when I was living in New York in the late 80s and early 90s, working at the Museum for African Art, I paid close attention to the sort of contemporary art exhibitions and works presented in galleries, and became friends with artists, African-American artists who, through their work, were making reference to Africa. Artists like David Hammons, the Freudian slip that I showed you earlier. So, global Africa. We'll look at how our encounters between Africa and the West have transformed the visual arts of both regions. It is widely recognized that African sculpture changed the course of art of the early 20th century. But what is African art's influence in today's increasingly globalized world? The exhibition will open with images of water to refer to the Black Atlantic as ultimate altar, site of historical trauma, and to the invincible and transcendent strength of African culture as it permeates the Americas and the world. This section highlights the fluidity of culture as it points to its uncontainability. And in this section, one of the first works people will see is by Atlanta-based artist Alejandro Aguilera. Alejandro Aguilera was born in Cuba. This is a work called Restos Mortales. It includes this wooden sculpture at the center of the work, has stick figures that are inspired by the notations made by slave traders as they calculated how many bodies they could fit on a ship. But Alejandro has talked about how he's referencing the Black Atlantic experience, but also the Cuban experience of people leaving by boat for Miami. And then the sort of disorientation. So north, south, east, and west are all mixed up in this work. Restos Mortales is also a term used to refer to heroes in Cuba today. And Radcliffe Bailey's Uprooted, alongside Fred Wilson's Atlas that charts the diaspora with black pushpins. Then there are 6 sections, so ancient sources will include David Hammond's African American flag. This work, David has described how in this work he is trying to bring greater attention to the contributions to African contributions to the Americas, under-recognized contributions. And in a parallel way, Fred Wilson's installation at Metro Pictures some years ago points to the under-recognized contributions of Egyptian civilization to Greco-Roman civilizations. And then in this section as well, so ancient sources, this section links the history of the early Americas to the history of ancient African civilizations. It underlines African contributions, technological and creative innovations, as essential to the development of the early Americas, and at once considers how artists draw on the rich cultural traditions of ancient Africa as an infinite source of creative inspiration. So here, in this series of prints by the British artist Tony Phillips, History of the Benin Bronzes, he's telling the history of the Benin bronzes, but that were many of which were taken to Britain in the 1897 so-called punitive expedition. But he retells this history from the point of view of the sculptures. And this is a relatively recent photograph of the Oduduwa brass masks of Benin in actually performance. And then third section of the exhibition, More Than Wood. This is a painting by Sherry Samba. He did this painting when he was in Europe studying an African art collection in Switzerland, and he talked about how isn't it ironic that as a contemporary African artist he has to go to Europe to study his ancestral traditions. I'm hoping that we may actually commission Sherry Samba to create a similar work, but including works from the Richman collection. And this work is by Carrie James Marshall. Carrie James Marshall has invented a character called Rhythm Master. And these works are inspired by comic strips, as you can see. Rhythm Master, well, taking the form of a comic strip. The work tells the story of, this is the artist's words, tells the story of a group of teenagers in an African-American urban neighborhood in which lawlessness has reached an extreme level. Superhuman intervention is required. A character named Rhythm Master teaches the young hero how to unlock the secret power of a series of African sculptures by using certain rhythmic patterns. I think this is a really interesting idea, putting African art in museum collections to new uses. And hope to include works by Willie Cole. Here you can see he's reworked lawn jockeys and named the work House and Field, inspired by Congo and Kisi sculptures. And this is one of David Hammond's spitting image sculptures, where he takes a Punu mask, mass-produced for the Western market, and then turns it into a water fountain spitting image. And also inspired by the Mardi Gras feather headdresses. And Howardina Pindel's Picasso's Studio, the French collection. Lorna Simpson's Flipside. And next section focuses on improvisation, to present works by artists inspired by the richly patterned polyrhythmic improvisational aesthetic of African culture. It conjures a jazz aesthetic and structured spontaneity as a way of working. So in this section we'll include Howardina Pindel's dot painting. Dot paintings are dot, they're sort of half sculpture, half painting. These works show a sensitivity to the color-coded pantheon of Yoruba religion, sacred performance, and beadwork, while at once informed by minimalist art and color-filled painting. Just as Yoruba dancers respond to the rhythms of more than one deity, Pindel's dot paintings combine multiple sources of inspiration. Chris O'Feely's large-scale works are also in some ways inspired by Yoruba beadworking traditions. This is a work that I recently saw in view at the Harn Museum in Gainesville. It's by contemporary artist Ella Natsui. Ella Natsui was born in Ghana, but in 1975 moved to Nigeria and has lived and worked in Nigeria ever since then. He's taught, and also has a very large sort of workshop with lots of assistants helping him create these very magnificent large-scale works. This is called Hovar. These works are actually made out of metal, but reference traditional African textiles. The detail, they're the metal caps that come from bottle caps, reworked into a sort of cloth-like form. And in this section we'll include the High's Sam Gilliam Firefly Blacktop. I'm afraid this is not a good quality image, but I understand the work is, I have not yet seen it, but very magnificent surface. And then the second to the last section of the exhibition focuses on art and action. This is a work by a Brazilian artist that presents images of young people playing capoeira, the Afro-Brazilian martial art form, played now all around the world. And this is Teo Ashetu's Brave New World. I saw this work when it was presented in a digital exhibition in New York. It's a kind of trompe-l'oeil. It has a tacky gold frame. At first, the work appears to be two-dimensional, but then you approach and see that, in fact, it goes deep into the wall, 6 feet, and there are mirrors line the space so that the video image that projects through that space becomes a kaleidoscope of whirling images. Teo Ashetu is a multimedia video artist. He lives and works in Rome. He's half Dutch and half Ethiopian. And the imagery that is included, projecting from the video screen, there are whirling images of Ethiopian processions, airports, and other footage from places around the world he's visited. And then these are works by Terry Atkins. It's actually a set called Sanctuary. The drums and this sculpture are a unit. And Terry has told me that this work can be installed to go as high as the space will allow. Final section of the exhibition, Beyond Boundaries. In this section of the exhibition, this section charts a path for the future of African art, and in an increasingly globalized world, it presents both black art and post-black art using Thelma Golden's term, to advocate for artistic and intellectual freedom while liberating artists from cultural stereotyping and honoring individual aesthetic choices. Works that show no signs of African cultural influence are presented alongside works by artists who draw attention to issues of cultural identity. So this section will include Julie Moretu's work, hopefully this example, Arcadian Bush Burning from 2000, Iona Brown's work, Kingalez's project for a third millennium, Odili Donald Odita's Interzone, and Yinka Shonibari's Scramble for Africa. This work is very large scale. The figures are life-size. It references that moment at the end of the 19th century when European powers gathered together to divide the continent, so it's called Scramble for Africa. Global Africa presents works created since 1972 to show how artistic practices are informed by art of the past as artists spin African art into new forms. Using the broad history of the Black Atlantic experience to structure its thematic framework, the project links contemporary art of Africa and the African diaspora on the continent, in Europe, and throughout the Americas. The exhibition navigates a deep, rich history that remains too little studied and understood to illustrate what Chicago art critic Nathaniel McClin describes as, quote, a vertical plane that starts in Africa and connects Africans in the Americas through a line of artistic innovation. So while I think it's very important for the High Museum to present contemporary African art, I would be most thrilled if we could acquire, like the Kimball Museum did, an ancient terracotta, a royal portrait, made perhaps during the 11th century. I think works of art of this caliber are important items of world heritage and really should be seen by as large a public as possible. Or another example, this is from the collection of the National Commission of Museums and Monuments in Nigeria. Or this is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum, an ivory hip mask that was carved in the 16th century during the reign of Esigie. It's a portrait of his mother, Idia. And as a detail, this is alternating at the top of her coiffure are Portuguese faces and mudfish, Portuguese mudfish, right? And Portuguese faces all around. This is a Congo Nkisi sculpture, very large-scale Congo Nkisi sculpture. It's perhaps, I think, about three feet high. It's in a private collection in Westchester. There are only 12 examples of large-scale Nkisi sculptures of this importance. Detroit has one. Dallas Museum has one. This would be an unbelievably fabulous addition to the Heise collection. Whether we'll get there or not, I don't know. And this is an image that was, well, you can see 1874. A whole group of miniature Congo Nkisi were taken from the Luango coast of what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I want to read one last quote from an article that appeared in the New York Times, and then I'll end. It appeared in the Times on August 4th. The title of the article, London Sees Political Force in Global Art. This was reporting from Paris, August 3rd. It was purely coincidental, but between the London bombings of July 7th and the failed bombings of July 21st, a commission on African and Asian heritage appointed by London's mayor issued its first report called Delivering Shared Heritage, which recommended ways of recognizing and integrating the contribution of Black and Asian minorities, quote unquote, to the life, culture, and history of the city. Skipping down, questions of history and heritage are interwoven with those of identity. A significant African and Asian population has lived in London since the 18th century, or I think probably earlier. And for 2 centuries, Blacks and Asians have been present in politics, law, culture, and the armed forces. But until recently, their contributions, like that of African Americans, was not acknowledged in school textbooks or museums. The report highlights the perils of this lack. When a community's heritage is denied, ignored, or overshadowed, it warned, quote, "The outcome can be debilitating, leading to disaffection and disillusionment, a sense of disenfranchisement, and contributing to socioeconomic decline." And it added, quote, this is that report, Delivering Shared Heritage, "In London, this has been the untold part of the story that urgently needs to be addressed." And I think the initiative of an African art gallery at the High at least moves us in the right direction. On December 3rd, Saturday afternoon, December 3rd, Dr. Robert Ferris Thompson from Yale University will speak in Rich Auditorium. The title of his talk is Congo Carolinas, Congo New Orleans, Central African Impact on United States Culture. This is his title was already determined before the events, before Katrina. When I emailed Robert Ferris Thompson more recently, he gave a talk similar to this talk at the Museum for African Art in New York, and that's when I got the idea to invite him here. But Robert Ferris Thompson emailed me back and said New Orleans is forever. So please mark your calendar for December 3rd. I'm thrilled to be able to invite a speaker of this caliber to come to Atlanta to celebrate the opening of our new African Art Gallery. Thank you.